KTLO is here because we are keeping the learning on, and that's the way it is, as Walter Cronkite used to say. KTLO. And today is episode 30. 30, folks.
Wow.
Episode 30. But I digress.
It's 3-0, but I don't know who's the 3 and who's the 0.
Well, I'll own up to that, I think.
Feel like we can sort that out pretty quick.
Yeah. and we do have some lovely guests on today. We have the return of Kathy Veldboom.
Hi, Kathy.
The sequel.
Yay.
And we have NJ Robinson on this morning.
Morning, NJ.
Or this afternoon in Simone's case. But
good morning.
The core team is here, and that is Patty Blackstaff, Greg Sanker, Simone Jo Moore, who is in France.
Greg, you realize that the little visual that you just did doesn't work with the live stream to YouTube. You have to say something with it.
Okay. I mean, even now the camera is not on me. Hello, camera.
The camera will not go to you.
Oh, that's awesome.
So, yeah, there we are. And so for those of you who are joining for the first time, Patty is in Alberta, Canada. Greg is in Oregon. And Simone is in France, where it's later in the day, and therefore some wine may make an appearance.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I'm not talking about absolute, but that's a whole other thing. And I am in South Carolina, as we say, in the US of A. And today we're going to talk about digression, distraction, and other silly things. So hang on to your hats. And the interviewer du jour is our French component, French Aussie, Simone Jo Moore. Does that make you a frosty?
Merci, mes amis. Merci. C'est le soir, c'est le vin de soie, c'est un rosé.
Le vin de soie.
C'est le vin de soie, c'est un rosé. Okay, so hang on. Now I have to change the thing in my head. So if my English comes out really the wrong way around, or is that the right way round for the French ears? I don't know. It's because of that issue. So, hey, welcome. This is going to be a very interesting thing. These guys are used to me interviewing. We're going to crack the whip a bit today because we've got some hard stops. As you know, that happens. It might be a Friday, but it's morning for them. So they've got stuff they got to do. But that doesn't mean we're not going to have an interesting conversation. So, but I digress, as I just did. So let me start with digression. How do I understand digression? Learning the French language. When you up stumps, which is a very Aussie term, up stumps and move to another country, and don't even know the language when you first arrive in the country, there's a pretty big learning curve. And as a result of that, you end up taking some, courses. And my French teacher, before I could learn, all the grammar or the vocabulary, when you only have so much vocabulary or so much understanding of the grammar, it takes a long time to get to a point. I'm sure you guys know people like that anyway, at parties, in boardrooms, in team meetings. It can take a long time to get to a point. And that's exactly what it is when you don't have the vocabulary and you don't have necessarily the understanding of what's going on, or you're not exactly sure of the destination of where you're trying to get to. And that's what happens with the French language. You end up going round and round and round until you get to the point. And that's why Paris, if you know anything about the way Paris is shaped, is like the snail. It actually starts in a very tight center, and the arrondissement numbers, or the little areas, or I don't know, what would you call it in the States? Counties, councils?
County.
Yeah, in Australia, we'd call them council areas. And you start with the one, and very tightly it winds around and around. And they decided that they would do it in a clockwise fashion as they moved out and out and out to the boundary until they reach number 20, because there are 20 miniature cities, they call them, because each one has its own little culture and its own little joie de vivre, if you like, and the way it does things. So
That's why we
Thinking
play the French quiz show game, Où est l'arrondissement?
oui, parce que c'est fou. It's crazy. It's crazy, guys. So I'm going to come back to Roy, and I want you to think about how we digress, how we move around our organizations, our teams, our people, our relationships that we have. How does digression play into creativity, Roy?
Digression is a very interesting thing. Squirrel. No, that's distraction. See, digression basically means to split something into two ways, and often our brain will just fixate on something that takes us off our regular path, the path of our thoughts. Your train of thought derails, as it were, and off you go down a little different route. But sometimes we see things along the way, and this can happen in distraction too, but this is internal. Digression is more internal. I digress. When I'm speaking, I go off on a tangent, perhaps, whereas distraction usually comes from external factors. And but while that's happening, our brain is processing stuff in the background, and sometimes it's nice to get off on that extra path, look at the trees, see the flowers, stop and smell the roses, and suddenly whatever you were thinking about originally comes back to you, and bang, you have a solution to your problem, or you have the next step that you have to do. So it can be a very nice step in the creative process.
I think so. You meander those little alleyways. One of the best things you can do when you're either in a new city or a new location, and I include in that even a new role in an organization, is to meander the alleyways, because it's surprising what you actually may discover. So, Patty, what's missing right now, do you think, that's causing us to digress, distract, or create, given that those things are slightly different in their intent or experience?
So right now we have a little thing called the pandemic going on. Yeah. And, we made a commitment at the beginning of this that we weren't going to focus on that, but it's certainly affecting and impacting us. And right now, one of the things that's happening is our inability to get those spatial moments, that little bit of time. A guy named Gabriel Radvansky in 2011 did this little, it's a fairly good experiment. It was pretty cool. But he wondered why every time we walk through a door, we forget something. And there's something that happens when you change environments. You literally leave the old environment behind you and you step into a new environment, and your heightened senses have you taking a look around and seeing new things and scoping the landscape, I guess you could say. But what it does is it makes us forget something. So these are our event boundaries. We had an event, we were doing things, we were holding things, we had a set of keys, we walked through a door, we don't know where we put our keys down, we have to walk all the way back and try and retrace our steps to see what happened, because our brain does a brain dump. So right now what's happening is we're missing those moments. We're going Zoom call to Zoom call to Zoom call to Zoom call to Zoom call, and we're not at the airport for 30 minutes waiting for a flight to go to a conference. We don't have downtime between. We don't have the ride in the car where our mind is allowed to meander into a different space. We're missing things. There's no transition time between environments. And an interesting thing, though, in 2014, Zachary Lawrence and Daniel Peterson took that experiment, and they said, yeah, but. So they said,
I love the way he's finally got a pair of headphones so he can listen to everything.
So they said, yeah, but could we recreate that just by using our mind? And so they recreated the experiment by imagining yourself walking through the door. It's called the Event Horizon Model. And what happens is you can still do that. And that's why meditation and being present and breathing is really important. And we have to build in time in between that, right? The merging of our lives and our work was a problem before the pandemic. We were hearing all kinds of reports about people who felt 24/7 on and all of these things. And now that we're missing the airport and the hallways and the coffee shops and the drive to work, the merge of our lives is just like increased.
Yeah, absolutely.
20-fold, right? Everything right now that was happening before has either been heightened or accelerated. And so we're in the middle of reevaluating what's important, what's happening, and we're still processing that in our mind while we're unable to digress into creative space away from the attention. And so it kind of catches us up, it kind of hooks us,
Yeah, I really like it. The funny thing though is that when you mentioned that term event horizon, all I can remember is the movie though. And if anyone's never watched the movie, it wasn't necessarily a fun one. It was interesting. It wasn't necessarily fun. So when I think of event horizon, I have to actually make sure that I pull back and look at it with curiosity and kindness and think this is an exciting time to move into.
I think that study actually made me feel better because I kept forgetting things and I'm like, what was I in here to do? Am I getting that old that I can't remember anything? And then the study came out and I'm like, thank you.
Brilliant. Hey, Roy, I mean, you know a little bit about event horizons and walking through doors. So what have you got to say?
I was just reminded of one of my favorite places on the planet, which is an old mansion, really, called Olana, which is Arabic for our place on high. It was built by Frederick Edwin Church, one of the early Hudson River School painters, and it overlooks the Hudson River. It's an absolutely gorgeous place. Church learned how to play really interesting tricks with glass, and there's a doorway in Olana that you look above the doorway and there's 3 panes of glass. The center one is dark gray, and then you walk through the doorway and look back and it's gold. It has a different color from one side from the other side. Absolutely amazing. But Church must have known something about that change in thought as you go through the doorway, because it's a different doorway depending on which way you're looking at it. It's very just interesting. I was reminded of that.
It is definitely a different perspective. Greg, you've got a few different perspectives considering the different projects and change and everything that you've been doing. So how can leaders, and Patty brought this up too, when we think about how we get distracted, how can leaders actually be accessible to staff and remain free, I guess, from the digressions and distractions?
Yeah, because we get so much of all of the above. And so I fancy myself an open door manager or a leader within an organization. If somebody comes in my door, I aspire to give them the attention. But one of the challenges that comes with that is people do come in your door, and they come frequently. And so there's the, how can I be successful at, I need to get this document complete by noon today for a 1 o'clock presentation, when there's a nonstop stream of people at my door, all of whom are important, or, I can learn something, grow something, understand what's going on. And so that's one of the challenges I think we face is if somebody comes into your room and I'm looking at you and I'm doing this like, yeah. It's the message is really, really clear. You're not important. Go away. I'm not really listening to you. And yet something really, really important might be happening over here. And so I've kind of made a bit of a study out of like, how do you manage both? And one of it is, I actually started by, you might have heard of this exercise, is on either a 15-minute or a half an hour increment, just write down what it was that primarily dominated that period of time and map out your day. And what you find, and if you categorized it in the quadrants of urgent and important, what you find is a lot of what you spend your time on frequently as leaders is the urgent, I need an answer right now. I need your thought. I need you to, pay attention, the one, hey, I just sent you an email. Somebody shows up in your office. Hey, I just sent you an email. It's like, okay, thanks. So one of the things that I went to work on, just in terms of some practical takeaways, is I configured my office such that I was facing a wall where my door was off to the left. And so I would see in my periphery somebody come in, and I would turn to them and greet them and find out what they need. And if it was something that we needed to have a conversation, I would get up from my desk and go over to this table over here, and I would leave my technology, including my personal mobile phone, at my desk, and I would walk over here and say, let's talk. And what I found is that you can get to the relevant issue much more quickly if you don't try to multitask, and if you don't try to say inside of your mind, I really don't have time for this conversation, but I want to be part of this conversation. Is give the conversation what it's due. The other piece that was a little bit uncomfortable to me initially was being willing to guide the conversation. For instance, this conversation isn't going to be done in 15 minutes, and I have some things I need to work on. So what I'm going to do is schedule some time for us to get back together. I want you to think about it, and we'll talk about that at some point in time. So take ownership for the fact that you do have constraints. It's not that the people that come in own your calendar. You own your calendar. You own you and your assignments and whatnot. So that's one of the things that I've really gone to work on is managing my interruptions. But the interesting thing is, Colin Powell once said that, when people stop coming to you with your problems, you've stopped leading them. And so all these problems that came to my door, I try really hard to go, yes, that's awesome. Thank you for all these problems. Now, could I do something? Like, I need to do something about that, right? But you learn something from those people. And so they're really, really important. So when somebody comes in and says, I just can't stand so-and-so anymore. And it's like, okay, this feels like drama to me. It's like, I don't have time for drama, right? But you can learn about the dynamics within your organization from their perspective. And so asking good probing questions and allowing them to say their piece rather than go, I don't see so-and-so the way you're saying it. It's like that's not helpful. I don't learn anything when I do that. So
yeah,
so
I think the open door policy is such a critical element, isn't it?
Yes.
It really is. And Roy, I loved that the description you had about how it was gray on the outside, and when I walked through the door and I turned back and I looked at the door and everything was gold. If I'm going to cross into that space of digression, or if I'm going to walk through another door, then I kind of hope, and there goes that. See, distraction. Can you hear that in the background? Yeah, that's the do not call register does not always work here. That's the distraction.
But it's a French ring, and it's kind of nice, actually.
Yeah, it's kind of it has a lyricism to it. See, but I digress. So, in regards to that, I think it's quite interesting because I had an open door policy as well, and I think you are very, very right. We do need to make sure that we don't want the people that walk in to feel that they are the interruption, as opposed to maybe the subject or the time being the interruption. I think that's a very tricky balance and thing to do as a leader, that it's a digression, not an interruption. So, hey, NJ, hopefully you're off mute there. Welcome to your very first KTLO. Tell us what your understanding is or experience or your comment around digression and time management.
And so kind of picking up from Greg's statement, which is really well, I like you talked about I guess I call it the time management tool of the urgency, importance and such. And so I have open door policy as well for a lot of my actually anyone, but my direct reports, they come to me often. And so I can use digression based on the situation at hand. So understanding, do I really have time to take this conversation, or do I really need to, shelve it for later on? But when I have that time, sometimes my direct reports don't know. And so what I'll do is I'm always looking pretty active and busy. I have them sit down. Maybe I'll over dramatize the moment of, hey, if really showing that what you have right now is the top priority. And I will do it in effect. So I'll start talking about whatever it is. And I really love it when it's a teaching, when I just sense those teaching moments. And I'll start off with the point, and then I'll digress to our story to really communicate the point. Because for me, it's showing that, hey, not only do I have time for you, I'm going to expand the time I have for you by telling you a story and really engaging the conversation at a deeper level. So I guess a positive way of using digression, but and I think it's positive, but you also, like, really to Greg's point, is you really have to understand the time and prioritization of that time in that conversation at the moment.
Yeah, Kathy, I'm going to come to you on this one because, I've been talking about walking through doorways and stuff like that. But, you've been through a few revolving doors, if you like, that sometimes it's that like, when you played that game, like spin around and you're not quite sure which direction you're going to end up in.
Many days like that, especially in the field that I've been in, whether it be revolving doors of companies or revolving doors of what's going on in the day. There can be so much going on in the day that you can have your entire team feeling a sense of utter distraction. It's coming in from customers, it's coming in from other departments, it's coming in, a new release gets to get pushed out the door. I think one thing, I'm going a little bit I'm digressing from NJ internally, to say that the importance of helping our team through distraction. When distraction is beneficial and when distraction is counterproductive. And I think that has to start from within. Within, as you said, and someone can come in, they've got quite the experience, situation going on. It's where do we go from there?
So Kathy, how do you keep them separate? How do you keep a distraction from being a digression and vice versa? You talked about.
Hang on, a
Mindfulness.
decoration? Can you just qualify that?
Yes. A decoration. Mindfulness.
Hang on, it was pretty, it's sparkly, and I've gone, oh, squirrel.
Oh, are you talking about the snow? I could switch my camera out the door. I let the team know that it started heavily snowing here in Minnesota, which is not uncharacteristic of October. But
That's
see,
not necessarily a bad distraction, is it?
it's not, and I got back on track.
Kathy,
But mindfulness.
My question. Are you just avoiding the question? Is it?
No, my answer to that is mindfulness. Mindfulness.
Mindfulness and presence.
Presence. Oh, took the word out of my mouth.
Yeah. See,
Yeah.
And as Kathy actually wrote that in the chat and say, oh, it started snowing here, I went, oh, I'm so excited. I mean, where I grew up, I mean, snow for me, I mean, Australia has many climes, and of course we've had many winter sport champions in Australia, but for me it wasn't a norm. So for me to watch as snow starts falling, it's something so magical. I'm quite happy to spend time in that moment. Anyway, I digress. So, Roy.
And I distracted.
And you distracted. So, is
And
distraction always bad, Roy?
No, absolutely not. Sometimes distracting can be beneficial in lots of ways. I was reading a story yesterday about, from your neck of the woods, Patty. This is a story from Alberta. It's a story about a 12-year-old boy who was out hiking with his dad and saw something on the ground that kind of looked like a bone, and walked it over and looked at it more closely, and it decidedly was a bone, but a very large one. And he had been reading about dinosaurs and such and said, hey, this is a dinosaur bone. And in fact, it was an important find in the world of fossils. They took pictures, and they sent the pictures to a museum of prehistory, and they said, yes, this is a dinosaur bone. And they went out and had scientists do their investigations and so forth. Had they been paying strict attention to the trail that they were following, they never would have found the dinosaur bone.
Mm-hmm.
So distractions can be good. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, here goes Roy in a language story. Traho trahere trache tractus, distraction, the root of distraction, Latin, sorry, is pulling, a tractor, right? Pulls. Digression, gress, is to go, egress, congress. But
We had that conversation earlier. Don't go there.
So that means to go. So that's more internally, something that happens internally, and a distraction is something that comes from you external, something you see, something you hear, something you spot, and Next thing you know, squirrel.
I do have to say that there's two things out of that story that I am so familiar with. My hubby is actually an archaeologist and ancient and modern history professor. So this getting distracted while he took me on various trips throughout Europe is amazing, because we would come across where he's actually been on digs or something like that. And I love, this is the difference. I think this is a digression, distraction thing. I love all the depths of the stories and the magic, all that surrounds that. Whereas a scientist, he is far more interested in the facts and the numbers and the dates and how it all fits together in the exact storyline. And I think that this is how organizations are as well. The difference is in the people, about whether they're surrounded in that the story, or they're interested in the storyline, I think is quite an interesting thing. And the other side of it is squirrel. So because he no longer has a mobile phone, and so if we're at one of those French markets, and which can be, well, okay, not so quite crowded these days, given the circumstances. But it was that if you are going to get separated, we used to yell out squirrel. That was our keyword for going, squirrel. I just got distracted by something. So I think this happens in a work organization a lot, where I even developed baseball signals with some of my team, that because they're on the call and can't say, I know, I can see, Greg, you're laughing at that so much. But hey, my cousin used to play for the LA Dodgers, so don't diss that. So I used to sit.
I've worked in a call center. I've managed a call center, and the stuff that happens behind the scenes is phenomenal.
It is phenomenal. I know. So even with an open door policy, we used to have visual signals all the time, and, yank the ears and, do various things and stuff to signal while they're on the call with the customers. We would do that so that we could have a dual conversation. And I'm actually just wondering about that dual conversation, distraction, digression. I have to say something separate to what I'm currently saying now. Those types of things are really kind of cool. And now I'm completely distracted from where I was actually going to go on this, because it was an amazing thing. And Greg, since you've actually started on that, let me come to your, let me ask you about, is this like a road less traveled? Is it a good or is it a bad thing? Lead off what we've been talking about in regards to that.
That's a really good topic. I've used the phrase "the road less traveled by," and we don't have time to go into all of my thoughts around that. But I'll start with this: if you go the digression, and you go the road less traveled, you discover things, you learn things, and you learn things that you didn't know that you needed to learn or wanted to learn. It's like the difference between, looking for videos on Amazon Prime or no sponsorship or whatsoever. You can't flap me. Versus going into an old-fashioned video store where you just wander up and down the aisles and you see this is a faded DVD cover, and so it's probably old, or this one's been handled a lot, so it got my attention. There's all these factors associated with the road less traveled that you discovered things. And one of the things that I found in organizations is if you literally do the whole management by wandering around, which I'm a student of, is you can learn things. I used to work for a corporation that had founders who were famous for just walking out and sitting down with somebody and say, "So tell me about what you're doing." So somebody that's, entering data in a database or running a drill press would sit there and tell the founding fathers of the corporation what they do. And the founding fathers would ask questions like, "So why are you doing it like this? What help me understand what that is?" And you learn things about the process. And I practice that as a CIO. And I did that with my customers. And one of the things that I did by just going out and asking questions is I learned that there was a lot of friction or frustration with the use of technology that I'd never heard about as somebody in that IT shop. They're like, oh, that thing never works. We never use that. It's like, what? That's our flagship application. Like, tell me about this. Why is it? It always crashes. It's just like, so we just, we work around that. And you learn these things, but I wouldn't have learned that if I would have had a relationship or, just those formal things and not the informal of, let me just go and find out. So to me, there's a tremendous amount of value in it. And there's a whole study around the management by wandering around of structuring your time and what kind of questions they ask. Because it can be micromanagement too. Oh, here comes the big boss. He's going to ask you questions like, how come you aren't done with your thing yet? So there are nuances to doing, and there's a cultural context in which that really, really works. But
Absolutely.
I found that the road less traveled is where you learn.
It is. And I think, but interestingly, what you've been talking about, the MBWA, which has always been one of my absolute favorite things, grab a coffee, wander around, but I've taken it beyond what the traditional meaning, like if you look up, what is MBWA, you're going to get all these formalized ideas of what is the process of it and so on and so forth. And for me, it's never been that. MBWA was always, there's a favorite movie I have, anybody that wants to get to know some of the really core Aussie traits, watch The Castle. And it really is, what's the vibe of the thing? Because that's exactly what it's supposed to be about. It's not just about getting the details of what's going on. It's really about getting a feel for what's happening in the environment at that time.
So all right. So I'm going to tell a story. A short. So I think I've mentioned before that the organization that I took responsibility for as a CIO, there's a lot of tension between people. Just, I walked into the service desk and in my mind is what you hear when they're not on call, what you feel in the environment of your call center, your service desk. That's what your customers will feel. And so I walked over there and there's tension and there was fear and we don't talk about that. We don't talk to each other. And so I was known for, once upon a time, and yes, I regret this, I did the whole leprechaun where I pushed off and I clicked my heels and I sat down and everybody in the room was like, what? Did you just do that? And I said, yeah, and I probably can't do it again to save my life. So for 2 years, I had to recreate that event on a semi-regular basis. And the tension just melted and people started talking. And I just sat down in one of the empty desks in the call center and I just start talking. And I would talk about anything, not necessarily work. And at first they didn't know how to do that. And the very people that I wanted them to talk to started drifting over like, this sounds like a fun conversation. You guys.
Yeah, exactly.
And then pretty soon, there was conversations that hadn't previously happened. And one of the things, I'm sure this will really greatly surprise you, but I started a daily thing where I'd go into the break room, which was right next to the service desk, and I would write riff of the day, guitar riff of the day. It eventually was known as the International Riff of the Day. And so, 2 months into this, I'm like, I got to get to that meeting and I got this report to go like, hey, Greg, what's the riff of the day? And that was it, right? So by wandering and not having even a particular point or even a particular agenda, I started building bridges and I started opening up lines of communication. And it's not that I'm heroic. It's just I was a catalyst for what they wanted to do in the first place. The story isn't about me. I'm the jerk in the story. I'm the guy that tried to click his heels and looked like a fool. I'm quite sure.
But you know what, Greg? I think to your point on that, I think okay, imagining you in shining red ruby slippers clicking your heels, Robin Williams would be proud of you.
Yes, he would.
He really would. And I think that's absolutely brilliant. You're right. A leader actually creates points of, I don't know, being a catalyst. That's part of what a leader does, is becoming a catalyst, I think, in lots of ways. But Patty, let me come to your point around that, because in doing that, sometimes it's just too much information to process, too much noise around us to really focus. And that causes us to get distracted or digress from where we really want to be. How do we filter all that noise down to what's really important?
When we talk about what's important, we're talking about value. And I think I love the story, Greg, about you going into the break room and going into, one of the things that I do when I first engage with an organization is I say, I'd really like an hour in your coffee room before anyone meets me. And I'll pull up my laptop and just sit there and kind of listen. I just listen, really, more than anything, to see what's going on. And one of the things you will notice is that director and hire are rarely there. They're rarely there. It's almost like the break room is off limits. And when they do walk in, there is this uncomfortable tension that occurs among the staff. And when you're in an organization like that, you can tell that they have not distilled value. And what is value? Value is quality of life. So we have quality of life at home, we have quality of life at work. Christina Baker Klein, in her book Orphan Train, had one quote that I really love: the things that matter stay with you and they seep into your skin. So there is a bit of a hierarchy, according to Peter Damrest, and this is going way back to the 50s in the study of axiology, but there is this really important level or hierarchy of value. And it is intrinsic, which is the most value, extrinsic, which is next, and then system, which is last. So intrinsic is the heightened focus of importance for the ties that matter, the relationships, the people, all of that. And that is your value chart, when you're at the top. So a leader's job then is to say, okay, is it about the people or is it about the things, the technology, that's the extrinsic, right? Or consumerism, or any of those things that are about things, not people? Or is it system, which are really kind of ideas, norms, agreements, that kind of thing? And when you look at trying to figure out how to filter the noise, the attention needs to go first to the intrinsic, to the relationships, to the people. When you are able to really balance between the three, the people and relationships, the things, or the system should come last, because everything else is foundational to that. Who you are matters. The tools you use to get where you're going are next. And then the agreements you have and the processes you have around that come last, right? And if you look at it in that hierarchy, then being present, like Greg talked about, this presence, and like Kathy talked about with mindfulness, that actually helps us lead into how do we do the intrinsic stuff. So some questions as someone who's worked with transformation and somebody who's worked with executives are, how might I maintain a renewed sense of importance for what matters? And right now, what's going on with so much work from home and people feeling a little bit or a lot distracted, or there are mini digressions, or there are all these things going on in the background, someone on the floor above you, it could be, or like Roy, the train outside, or whatever that distraction or digression is. What choice can I make today to keep value, to keep with the top priorities, right? And then you might ask about the things, the extrinsic stuff. How might we remain intentional about keeping our eye on what we value rather than drown it with things like dopamine hits? Before the pandemic, this is really interesting and fascinating to watch. We were on this high-speed wheel rat race of more. We're shopping, we're out, we're doing things. And the important distractions, when the child interrupts you, when someone has a problem at work, all the important distractions were kind of, I'll get to it. I'll get to it. And this year, 2020, has really sucked us into not sucked us in, but really immersed us
in a bubble. Yeah.
Yeah, it's immersed us in this need to really think about value and what's important. And with so many people going through so many difficult things, we really are taking a look at, well, you know, that career I'm in, is that really all that in a bag of chips, right? Is what I have focused on with consumerism. Is the house, does it really matter that much? How can I be intentional about that? So that's your extrinsic stuff. And when it comes to systems, now you're rethinking who you are. Our norms, they're toppled, man. Like, we've got to review and renew our social contracts. We're reviewing and renewing our work contracts. And I mean the interactions and how we're going to function within them, and the agreements, and everything is reshaping. There's this huge shift, and we need to always be intentional about what that shift looks like. So some questions you can ask are, how might we shift the systemic things that we were so comfortable with, so focused on in the past as things that were of high value, and really put that back down to lower value, where we can bring a renewed focus on the intrinsic and extrinsic things that lead to proper systemic.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think there's some very critical reevaluation I think people are actually going through. In terms of that, there is the choice between whether we are just ameliorating, sorry, I'm thinking in French again here, but these tiny little optimizations or improvements we make versus we are entirely evolving as a result of, because I think the differences between digression and distraction are becoming even more specific is not the word I'm looking for. See, there's the vocabulary thing again. Even more aware. We're more aware of the differences between those now. I'm doing the snail thing. Sorry, this is the language issue.
She's got her Fibonacci brain on right now.
Yeah, my Fibonacci brain is actually having some issues. So this is where I want to actually come back to Roy, to you, because as you said, like there is no norm. Our norm is actually part of our flow and how we're actually moving in and out of this sort of stuff. So what can being open, this is what I want to say, what can being open to digression actually accomplish in our lives?
It helps broaden your train, apparently, your train of thought. This is my train of thought coming through, and it's
not a moment too soon.
It's right on the rails this morning. So
you arranged that with them, didn't you?
I did. Yeah, I absolutely
folks,
did.
It's a sound effect. He's pressing a button on his computer and it's go woo.
This was completely pre-scripted.
Yeah. But anyway, if you allow your brain to rest and think of something else for a moment, and I think Kathy, you're nodding, and you probably have something to say about this as well. You get off the focus that you have. You allow your brain to rest a little bit. Your brain does its work, and there's a creative solution that suddenly appears. And this happens. There are so many stories in science and art about things like this. The one that I think of is Leo Szilard stepping off a bus onto the street and realizing that the atomic bomb was not only possible, but had to be made because somebody was gonna. Fascinating story. He was on a bus, and so I'm gonna toss it. I'm taking your job here, Simone. I'm gonna toss it over to Kathy because she has something to say here.
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it, Kathy.
I'm just going to take right off of what Roy said. I think not only is it, it's important to let your brain rest. There's a certain room I used to visit several times throughout the day at work, and my team hated it when I went there because I would come back just, chatty, this, that, I solved that problem. It's because I completely stepped away from what we were in. I think
did you become Chatty Cathy?
Yes.
Oh,
I have earned that name over the years. I have to confess to that.
Kathy, I
Um,
apologize on behalf of all humankind.
no, well, thank you. Thank you. But the other thing is knowing also not only when your brain needs to rest, but when the team's brain needs to rest. One big thing for me with intentional distraction is problem solving. And I think we've all talked about that. At the last place I worked at, we had a puzzle table going at all times, very complex puzzles, not just easy ones. And people would wander over and suddenly, you've got 3 people that are involved in a, serious situation, but having some people over there, they start to spark ideas that they can then bring back to the team that's, in the system trying to do the troubleshooting. I can't say enough. There is a very important purpose for intentional distraction. The filtering, that's equally important, but I'll stop at the importance of distraction.
Kathy, based on that note, I really enjoyed the phrase that you used was intentional. There are many of us that know that where we've attended conferences or certain meetings or been to a workshop or a training, and it doesn't matter what level we're at, whether we've been at support center analyst level, right through different leadership, or we could have been a HR manager or a finance, it doesn't matter. Whoever in the organization has been to that conference or that webinar, all of a sudden comes back with, and it's like whoompa. And it's like, whoa, hang on. Let's be intentional about what we're about to data dump here. And Roy, I want to come back to you on this one about separating creative digression versus creative distraction, so that we're not pulling people off the task they need to be on, but we still want to bring that oomph and that learning.
Well, I think again, going back to the roots of the language and why there are 2 words for similar ideas. One tends to be external, one tends to be more internal. And I think that it's a fine line one has to walk. But if you're distracted, but still bearing in mind something without even being aware of it, something about what that puzzle you're trying to solve or that next thought you're going to have is, that's a positive thing. Just being absorbed in, going down what we call going down the rabbit hole of the internet or social media or something else that pulls you off task is not productive. And as we've been talking about this, I mentioned Leo Szilard, but I also thought eureka, right? It's a eureka moment when you're walking down the street and suddenly something occurs to you, you've solved the problem. And have that percolating in the back of your mind.
Okay, Patty, I want to, because we're coming to the top of the hour, so I want to start rounding the conversation here in terms of, based on all of this then, what is the opportunity that's before us here?
So I want to talk a little bit about the doorway. We started with the doorway, and I want to kind of finish a little bit with the doorway. The opportunity really is like the astronauts that come back from space and have to spend time in a decompression chamber. We have things going on. It's a really stressful time, and it's more stressful right now than our daily, what we thought was really stressful before 2020. So think about your decompression chamber. What is that? Your doorway. What doorway can you walk through where you can also think about when you're dealing with others as well as yourself, because right now everyone's going through something really, really tough. So we have to have empathy, compassion, and consideration. One of the things that would be really important for us in this time is to take that pause, that break in the brain between things, but come back to it being other-centric instead of me-centric. Right? Well, how can I be compassionate and thoughtful and recognize that everyone else is going through something right now too? So the leadership presence right now that I think is really important is because we're shifting into this We've been in this for quite some time, longer than we expected to be. So being visionary, but communicative, action-oriented, inspiring, and strategic. We know we don't know what the future looks like, but we're gathering data to figure that out. And then we have to listen to many voices. We have a big opportunity for a huge human-centered value flip toward purpose. And if we can keep that in our minds, allow breaks for our team, allow breaks for us, challenge the structures. Remember, we talk all the time about our truths may no longer be true. And of all things, the system has to serve the people rather than people being hogtied to the system. And if we could remember that the system has to serve the people and the purpose. So my goal for you individually, if I were leaving you with what's the opportunity, it's be unreasonable, but not unrealistic, right? But if you're trying to be realistic, stretch, like take it just a little further, like be willing to stretch on that realistic piece. Invite others to do the same, because being unreasonable right now is what is going to launch us into a better tomorrow.
Yeah, I like that combination though. Unreasonable but realistic. That's actually a very personal balance line.
Mm-hmm.
I
It
think
is, absolutely. It is.
that
And it's based
that
on
could be a toughie.
Yeah, but it's based on our ideals. But being unreasonable means stop trying to be safe, right? We are so risk averse that, especially when we're in crisis. And so if we're focused on being safe more than we're focused on growth, then we're not being unreasonable. We're being too realistic, too reasonable. We need to be able to stretch past that. We need the opportunity as individuals to feel maybe just like, yeah, I'm already uncomfortable now, so why don't I make it just a little more uncomfortable? Why don't I
See
just
that to me reminds me of like the snail hiding in its shell, or the tortoise pulling back inside its shell, in a way, and trying to reassess your environment and understand, well, okay, how safe do I feel at the moment to put my vulnerability out there? That's what that reminds me of.
And yet we are vulnerable, because, so for instance, Simone, you are an artist and you're an incredible artist. And when you are in your art, if you're anything like me, you're lost in it. You absolutely get lost in it, and you push yourself further because you're kind of excited about trying new things. And if we can take that same thing that we do, whether it's I'm a runner and I'm going to push myself a mile further, whether it's I'm going to try a new riff, whatever that looks like, right? Expending ourselves past our comfort zone is what really allows our brain to rethink the present challenges and the present thoughts that we're in. Our mind is really cool the way it works.
Well, I did spend 5 hours in what I would call productive failure the other week in the studio. So productive failure, I think, is a really good phrase I would really invite people to adopt, because it really comes back to the whole, I've found 1,000 ways not to make a light bulb. So I think productive failure, it can be a very inviting digression to have. And I did specifically do that as a mental health, and I'm going to bring that phrase up. People do need digression also as part of mental health, because it does free up the mind from some of the stresses and strains that a lot of people are under, and allows us, I guess, look, whether you want to sing in the shower, or you want to listen to a webinar while you're cooking, or you're having a Zoom session with your mates, these are some of the restrictions that the boundary lines, I guess, that we are currently, as part of our context changes. I want people to remember that. So whether it's a distraction or a digression, our context that's surrounding us does continue to change. and at the moment, day by day. So I definitely want people to remember that. What I'm going to do now is a little round robin, because I
No,
think
we got to wrap up.
it's
We have to
it
wrap up.
is. We have to wrap up. It's
Absolutely.
Friday.
We have 1 minute to get out of here. So
We have 1 minute. So what are you going to do to distract or digress yourself this weekend that's going to make a difference to you, Roy?
first of all, I'm going to turn off the YouTube and start planning for next week's KTLO. So we really have to run. Thank you to NJ Robinson for stopping by. Unfortunately, he had to leave early, but we gotta get out the door here and see what's on the other side of that magic door. So
It's all gold.
it is right here on KTLO, keeping the learning
The learning on.